Hello, and welcome to our session. First, I would like to sincerely welcome all of you and thank you for joining us. Our session is going to briefly introduce you to the Education for Justice Initiative, or as we call it, E4J, which links SDG 4, Quality Education, and SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, to not only advance their achievement, but also support the achievement of all of the other Sustainable Development Goals. I am delighted to introduce you to a number of the legal educators who have for many years have been working behind the scenes of E4J as developers and peer reviewers and implementers to give these E4J experts a chance to convince you why incorporating E4J modules into existing tertiary education can help improve global criminal justice systems and institutions and advance SDG 16. This panel will use SDG 16 as the central discussion point to address different perspectives of ethics and integrity as they apply to youth, gender, race, and culture. And finally, we're going to close out our session by introducing you to a fabulous free online platform that will permit you to learn even more about E4J, learn about it more in depth, and understand how you can utilize it in your own universities and in your own communities. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Bianca Kopp. Bianca Kopp is the global coordinator of the higher education component of the Education for Justice Initiative at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Bianca has been working for the United Nations since 2010 and has worked for the UN Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force, the UN Democracy Fund, and various sections of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Prior to her UN work, she worked for the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a researcher and lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Salzburg in Austria. As a survivor of the terrorist attack on the UN in Nigeria in 2011, Bianca is a strong advocate for the role education has in countering radicalization and in strengthening the rule of law worldwide. Recently, Bianca accepted a new role as project coordinator for the STRIVE Juvenile Preventing and Responding to Violence Against Children by Terrorist and Violent Extremist Groups project under the UNODC Justice Section's global program against violence against children. Welcome, Bianca. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much. Now, it would be nice if you could please put on my PowerPoint presentation. What a nice welcome. A warm welcome from Vienna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all joining us today. Melissa has said it already. Today is about talking about the role teaching has on topics such as ethics and integrity, not only to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, but to strengthen the rule of law and to strengthen criminal justice around the world. I have to say it's an honor for me to be part of this panel today for a good reason. We have here today academics from different countries that all have something in common, and Melissa has mentioned it already. All of them are Education for Justice champions. What this means, I will explain in a few minutes, but it means in a nutshell that all of them are supporting the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in teaching on topics related to the rule of law and on SDG 16. Next slide, please. Before talking about the Education for Justice initiative and providing the context of this meeting, allow me to tell you a little bit more about the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Many of you know, of course, what the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, is doing. And if you will ask, but what has education to do with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime? It has to do a lot, but not always. And I want to talk a little bit about the journey, how we as UNODC realized that without education, without working with educators, we cannot advance the SDGs. So our mission statement is to make the world safer from drugs, crime, and terrorism. And our traditional approach has always been to work with member states, helping them to strengthen the capacities of judges, of law enforcement, of policymakers, to apply good rules, to apply laws, and to also train them on human rights approaches. However, we have realized that this approach, while it's a good approach and by our activities have led to a lot of success, it's not enough. And we also realized that we need to broaden and strengthen this approach. Why? Because we need to do more on crime prevention per se. And this is where education comes in. Almost 6 years ago, during the last Crime Congress, member states supported us in that when they adopted the political declaration, the Doha Declaration. So 6 years ago, all of us, like today we are meeting in Kyoto, 6 years ago we met in Doha, in Qatar, and the member states adopted this political declaration, the Doha Declaration. And it was the first time that member states agreed and highlighted how important education is for strengthening crime prevention, how important educators are for empowering the next generation. And this helped us, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, to kickstart the Education for Justice initiative. Next slide, please. Please press please press again and again and again, because there are 3 pillars showing on the slide now. The next. And the next. Thank you. So the Education for Justice initiative is a very comprehensive initiative. We're working at the primary, at the secondary, and at the tertiary educational level. Today, we focus on the tertiary, on the higher educational level, but I just want to mention that we're also working together with UNESCO, with teachers from primary and secondary school, because the idea is really to empower the next generation. And we need to start teaching on ethics, on integrity, on issues such as corruption from a very early time on to make a difference. However, today I want to focus only on what we are doing at the higher education. And there our approach has been led by 3 pillars. And it has evolved over time. What is so innovative with the Education for Justice initiative is that it was always a dialogue with our stakeholders, the educators, the academics. Why? Because we at UNODC, we know that we are not experts in education. The experts are here with me today on the panel. And those are the ones that have supported and driven this Education for Justice initiative. So the first and the biggest pillar is when we started in 2015, 2016, we were thinking, what can we do to strengthen teaching on rule of law, on ethics and integrity, on the SDG 16 around the world? What is missing? We did a global study and we realized that there are not enough courses taught at the undergraduate, but also the graduate university level. So we reached out to academics teaching on related topics and asked them, what can we do to strengthen teaching? And we had many ideas. And what we finally agreed on is to support educators by providing peer-reviewed, innovative teaching tools. We call them university models. We have by now more than 115 university models online, and all of them, and this was the biggest peer review exercise ever undertaken by a UNODC entity, all of our models have been peer reviewed by academics around the world to really ensure that we have a broad perspective in all our teaching material. And this led us to the second pillar, when we brought academics together from around the world in the different regions, peer reviewing materials such as the ethics and integrity models. We realized that by bringing them together, we are also achieving something, because nobody's bringing academics that teach, let's say, on ethics, the academics that teach on corruption together. And we are doing that. We have until now had more than 100 workshops, bringing thousands of academics together to discuss how we can teach in an innovative way on those topics. And also what is needed to advance this forward. Of course, now with the COVID pandemic, we had to go online instead of bringing the academics together face to face, but also this is what we have continued. And then the more workshops we had with these academics and with the educators, we realized there's also something missing. And this brings us to the third pillar. We realized we need to strengthen academia's voice, and we need to strengthen the bridge and the cooperation between the United Nations and those academics. Because let's face it, many of us work in silos. The academics work in silos, the United Nations staff work in silos, the policymakers work in silos. And this is not how it works. We need to bridge the gaps between those different silos and bring stakeholders together. And this is when we started hosting academic conferences together with universities around the world, where we also invited policymakers to really present latest research on topics where policymaking is taking place. When we then had these conferences, we realized, there's again something missing. What is missing? The new voices, the younger generation of scholars are often missing at these conferences. Why? Because many of them cannot afford to go to conferences worldwide. The young scholars just finishing their studies, the young PhD researchers, they don't have the financial means to go to these scholars. And this is when we launched the grants program for young scholars. We have recently, last week, launched another round of a young scholars grants program. It's still open until the 10th of March. So check that out, because this is a way to support also the next generation of scholars. And then what I might not forget is also our traditional grants program for higher education institutions. We also give grants to universities worldwide that want to become a hub for SDG 16 teaching. Why? Because it's crucial that we empower the next generation. They need to learn about those topics because it's the next generation. They will become the policymakers of tomorrow. They need to understand issues related to the rule of law, to integrity and ethics, and to other topics. Next slide, please. My colleagues here on the panel, we will all talk about the university model series on ethics and integrity, and we'll share with you how they have managed to integrate those topics into existing courses, how they managed to merge it into the university's curricula. But I want to give you a little bit a broader perspective. While ethics and integrity is, of course, at the core of our Education for Justice initiative, we have also other thematic areas that we're focusing on. Why? Because we want to support the academics, the young ones that just started teaching, but also the senior ones that often don't have time to come up with new exercises, with new innovative tools that they can share with their students. And this is why we have developed 9 thematic university model series, from ethics to integrity to corruption to crime prevention and criminal justice to wildlife crime and to counterterrorism, just to name a few. And again, I've mentioned it in the beginning, everything that we have developed was developed together with educators, with academics. Because again, we at UniDC, we are not experts in education. We want to work with you, the experts out there. And this is why academics have such a crucial role to play. Next slide, please. This is, and Melissa has already mentioned, the Education for Justice platform. So this is how the Education for Justice platform looks like. It's an online platform that hosts all of the material that we developed. The nice thing is the material is available in more than 7 languages. All our material is available for free. You can register. That allows you more access, that allows you to create content on our platform, and you can also get in contact with educators and academics that are working with us. Again, the platform is accessible from everywhere. It's online. It's a great one-stop shop, I would say, if you want to check out how can I start teaching, let's say, on cybercrime. And the approach that we have taken with our university models is a very broad one. So basically, it's about you can choose what you're interested in. You don't need to choose all the models on ethics and integrity. You can just choose whatever you're interested in and see how it fits in your ongoing course. Next slide, please. This is the example how the model series on integrity and ethics looks like. You will see we have 14 university models online, a teaching guide, and my colleagues, the other panelists here on that are here with me today, will give you a little bit more details how they have used the different models on there. Next slide, please. And this is in a nutshell how it looks like when we bring together academics and educators. We really bring them together in small groups, either having a national focus, a regional focus, and always a thematic focus. Bring them together to exchange this dialogue. You also have pictures here how it looks like when we bring academics to intergovernmental, to policy making conferences. And it's really many of the colleagues here with us today, and I look at Catherine because she has also been part of the intergovernmental meetings. It was a new experience, and sometimes it's just great for all of us to understand also the other side. The policymakers sometimes need to listen to the academics conducting research, and the academics sometimes need to listen to the policymakers, also realizing that, you'll have to adapt different perspectives. All of us, what we want to do is achieving the SDGs. And if we want to achieve the SDGs by 2030, it's high time that we start doing that in an innovative way. Stop reinventing the wheel and bring existing resources and existing stakeholders together. Next slide, please. And why do we want to do that? Because all of us want to influence and want to empower the next generation. Let's face it, it's their world. And the pictures you see in front of you are pictures of two of our Education for Justice youth champions. And what Maris says, really, I think, says it in a nutshell. Youth need to become active. How can youth become active? Through education. And this is why all of you here in the panel have such a crucial role to play. You are empowering your students, and your students are the next generation of policymakers. Teaching them on ethics and integrity is core for the further development, and let's hope that they become all positive actors of change. Next slide, please. With this, I just want to thank all of you and hand it back to Melissa, and I'm very much looking forward now, hearing from Helen, from Helena, from you, and from the others, how they have been inspired and why they have become E4J champions. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Our next speaker is Helena Waylon Bridge. Helena is an attorney admitted in Connecticut and California who works as an associate professor at the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law. She teaches legal ethics and advanced legal skills and has been a faculty advisor for the law faculty's student pro bono group since its inception in 2005. She received the NUS Teaching Excellence Award and serves on the law faculty's Teaching Excellence Committee. Her research addresses legal education, including the need to teach law students about corruption and legal ethics and access to justice. She participated in the drafting of a number of the E4J modules. Helena's two most recent books, Litigants in Person, Principles and Practice in Civil and Family Matters in Singapore by SAL Publishing, and The Role of Lawyers in Access to Justice, Asian and Comparative Perspectives, published by Cambridge, are both coming out this year. Welcome, Helena. The floor is yours.
Na, could I have the slides, please? I'll repeat my welcome just to make sure everybody knows that I said hello. Welcome everybody to our session. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whenever you're joining us, you are warmly welcome. I'm a law professor in a university, and I'm going to be focusing on education of lawyers and how we get lawyers to make good decisions. Na, could I have my slides, please? So, how do we get lawyers to make good decisions? Well, I think we've seen that there are instances of lawyers not making very good decisions. Next slide, please. Thank you, Na. Lawyers can fight against each other unduly when there is a litigation case. They can also engage in very serious matters such as theft of client money, or when they are supposed to actually be assisting clients, they may actually be hurting clients. And on occasion, they are actors in perverting the system of justice, for example, buying the judge and participating in bribery. So how do we get lawyers to make good decisions when they are not making very good decisions on occasion? Well, of course, law is a profession, and that means that for many countries, legal education is primarily professional, meaning it can focus on law subjects. Well, what about ethics in legal education? There is variation. And of course, sometimes law is an undergraduate degree and sometimes it's a professional degree. And if it's an undergraduate degree, then there is more room for ethics education. But there is a lot of variation. And there may be a course in, for example, professional rules, especially where law is a graduate degree. But it's unusual in most law degrees to have a course in ethics. Next slide, please, Na. Thank you. So there is a need to talk about ethics in legal education, but it doesn't necessarily occur. And if we think of now, if it's possible to go to the next slide, thank you. If we think about the things that lawyers are not, thank you, Na. If we think about the things that the very serious things that lawyers are making bad decisions about, we can relate them very clearly to ethics and values. So are lawyers serving their self-interest as opposed to, say, their client's interest, which they're supposed to do? Do lawyers not have respect for others? Sorry, we need to go back to the previous slide now. Do lawyers not have respect for others or their property? And is that leading to things like theft of clients or not taking care of clients properly? Do lawyers not have respect for the system of justice? And do they not value the justice that they're participating in, which could lead to not only supporting good decisions, but leading to bribery and other things? Okay, now we can go to the next slide now. Thank you. You can see that these things that lawyers are not making good decisions about, that they are not really so much related to professional values, although they are. These are basic values and basic ethics. So it's important to, in legal education, to not only talk about maybe the professional rules, and of course there are professional rules that apply to lawyers which are different from other people, but also we must talk about basic ethics. So how do we get lawyers to make better decisions? Professional rules are premised on ethics and values, but without the underlying ethics, the efficacy of these professional rules that guide lawyers is really quite limited. And if you think about it, it's these professional rules that lawyers are supposed to be following. In some ways, they're similar to criminal law. They establish a baseline. And people are not good, they're not ethical, they don't make good decisions because of criminal law. They make good or better decisions based on ethics, their own personal ethics and values. Next slide, please. So how do we get lawyers to make good or better decisions? We need to discuss ethics in education. And we need to do it not only in basic education, but also graduate education, such as professional education, like lawyers or even medical school. We need to talk about not just professional rules or professional ethics, but ethics more generally. And this is exactly where the Education for Justice modules come in. They are tools for teaching ethics. we're going to share a number of different websites and resources for you. And on this slide, you can see the main tertiary integrity ethics. And at the bottom, you can see also a link to the teaching guide if you want more information. But all right, so how are these E4J modules, how can someone in a specialized area benefit from them? Well, they're facilitated under the auspices of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, as we've heard from Melissa and Bianca. There is some translation into some languages, and that is also ongoing. They were reviewed by a variety of stakeholders, so they've been tested and tried. They're free access for lecturers, and also they're there for you to use and customize to your own aims and contexts. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we're wanting to support lawyers to make good decisions, if we're wanting to support any kind of professional or graduate education and having those students make good decisions, how do we do this as instructors, as educators? Well, of course, there's many challenges. And so instead of talking about the particular E4J modules, which I would encourage you to look at, they're really wonderful quality. But I would say what I'm going to talk about just for the last few minutes is how can a professor actually do this in a crowded curriculum? How can you work in ethics when you've got so much to do already? And what I would suggest is that actually ethics is already there in much of what we do. And speaking of ethics now, as you know, what is the right, the proper, the good thing to do in a situation where there are challenges? Those issues are already there in all the material that we're using, regardless of profession. We just need to make it explicit. Also, it can help us clarify points that we want to accomplish. So I can give some examples in the lawyer's professional rules. Let's say that you're a law professor and you're discussing the professional rules that lawyers are subject to. For example, why not steal from a client? That is inherently an ethical issue. Why not steal from anyone? And how is it different, a lawyer's theft from a client, how is that different from stealing from anyone? Another example would be, let's say that you're a professor and you're discussing a statute. You're probably discussing the purpose of the law at some point. So, for example, why should we follow traffic laws? Why do we have this law? Another example, and I'll end on this point, is let's say that with a law professor, you're discussing a case, or you're discussing something with an ethical issue which is not explicitly raised by the material itself. And this can occur, for example, with law professors when we're talking about a case report and there's an ethical issue that for some reason or other is not addressed by the judge in the opinion. For example, what if the lawyer is representing multiple parties with conflicting interests and they're not supposed to do that? Well, the point I would like to leave everybody with is there are ethical issues implicit in everything that we teach. And so if we ignore the ethical issues, we may actually be teaching students to ignore them rather than address them. So if it is possible in your material to make some of these implicit ethical issues explicit, the course, the material, and the teaching will be richer, and we will have told students and supported their ability to make good ethical decisions as well as good professional decisions. All right, thanks very much. That's all for today. Thanks again to everybody for participating. And I wish you the best in your teaching and your supporting ethical decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. Our next speaker is Helen Cruz. Helen is a senior lecturer at Rhodes University and is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa. Helen lectures and researches in family and customary law, legal ethics, legal skills, and jurisprudence. She practiced law in South Africa for 2 years before joining local government in London and for another 2 years. Thereafter, she's been in academia for just over 15 years, teaching at the University of Cape Town, the University of the Western Cape, and she's currently at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. She is an editor of the South African Law Journal and sits on the board of the International Association of Legal Ethics. Welcome, Helen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. It's just wonderful to be with all of you at various parts of the day and night. I'm going to get straight into it, but what I really enjoyed was Helena's kind of introduction to the Ethics for Justice project about what are the overarching themes of what we're trying to do. And so I'm going to take it from the universal to the particular in terms of trying to show how one can take a universal module from the Ethics for Justice project and localize it to the particular context in which in my case, lawyers operate. And I want to focus on the importance of context when taking these Ethics for Justice modules. So, Nga, if you could put up the slides, my slides, and starting on the second slide, if possible. Let's just have a look there. So the purpose of the intervention, and so let me just say how the universal becomes local. So the purpose of the intervention in which I've been involved with is taking module 14, the professional ethics module, and localizing it, adapting it to the tertiary, obviously the tertiary setting, but taking professional ethics, which relates to journalists, bankers, accountants, lawyers, making it specific to lawyers, but also specific to South Africa. And really the goal of the promotion of the professional ethics module is really about, to me, it's about peace, justice, and strong institutions, which is through access to justice. But also, importantly, coming from the global south, we find it incredibly important to focus on the SDG 10, which is on reducing inequalities. And really what that's about is trying to close the perceived gap between the values of the global north versus the global south. So if I could get to the next slide, what we're trying to do in the localization is to take the universal values, make them local, but also to move from rather a bottom-up approach to a top-down approach. And I think what the importance here is that one takes into account the kind of issues, particularly in your context or jurisdiction. So when you're looking at a localized model, what are the motivating concepts? And so I take my point of departure from Martin Channock, who talks about rejecting a top-down approach and rather adopting a bottom-up. And what does that mean? Well, he talks about the failure, the largely unsuccessful attempts at implementing constitutionalism in Africa from the top down. I see that there's a delay on my side. Can people hear me? Oh, good. Okay, well then I'll continue, but I'll probably try and go a bit slower. Okay, so the bottom up approach really is Martin Chanock's idea, and I'm going to just quote from what he says, which is the habit in academia, and more sadly in practice, has been to start at the top with the writing of increasingly complex constitutions, with increasingly sophisticated institutions and rights guarantees, which have, as has been shown time and time again, floated meaninglessly above the societies for which they have been designated, until the bubble bursts in outbreaks of violence. And that sounds quite dramatic, but what it does tell us is the need to, what he calls, use the basic intellectual and institutional re-engagement with the legal forms and processes with which Africans identify. So for the localization of this Ethics for Justice module, the focus is on looking at African values for African solutions to African problems, but with a universal dimension. So using the value of what is called Ubuntu as one way of instantiating ethical values and dispositions in our law students. So that's one of the localization methods. The other localization method is to take local problem questions and translate them into local languages. Now, obviously, in many countries, there's many different languages. But for our purposes, what we found is that even though tertiary institutions in South Africa have particularly the English language as the medium, for the rural universities, it's really important for student understanding to have at least those problems in first in their language of choice. The other aspect of the localization model that was particular to the South African legal ethics module was to then implement or to make up a case study video clip. And this has been incredibly successful in the sense that we managed to convince one of the top advocates in South Africa to, in a 17-minute video, give his story of one of the most difficult ethical decisions he had to make during the apartheid regime, when he was representing representing the people against the police during or in the aftermath of what was called the Langer massacre, in which the police opened fire on a number of individuals in a funeral march in the height of apartheid, and he then got to represent the people and trying to discover what caused that. So if I could get to the next slide, just to focus on the idea that whenever we're teaching these modules, we do have to look very carefully at the context of whatever jurisdiction we're applying them to. And so the context of South Africa would, just quickly going through them, post-colonial, post-apartheid, also looking at the type of system, the legal system. So we always think about the US Constitution as codifying the status quo, whereas in South Africa, because of a particular history, our Constitution is transformative, which is a change in the status quo. And this has important implications for the role morality of lawyers. So we have to learn from the human rights abuses of the past. We cannot assume an equal playing field. So the value of equal access to legal services is simply not there in South Africa, given that we are the most unequal. According to the Gini coefficient, the South African jurisdiction is the most unequal country in the world. And we also cannot rely on Western notions only of autonomy in a liberal individualist framework, but one in which we see autonomy in relation. And this really comes out in the next slide, where we've seen in contrast to the Sustainable Development Goal 16 of strong justice institutions, we've seen the breakdown of these institutions through what is being called the state capture of South Africa. And what state capture really means is that there has been a systemic political corruption where state institutions have been hollowed out or weakened by people who seek their own advantage. And the lesson in South Africa is that this could not have occurred without the bankers, the lawyers, and the accountants. And this has really stymied any progress in South Africa. So if we can look at the next slide, you can't see the top of the slide, but really what the Ethics for Justice project allows us to do is to move from a theoretical standpoints to practical standpoints to justice standpoints. So the importance of the localized Ethics for Justice a module is to look at the importance of history, importance of theory into practice, and moral development. So if you look at the jurisdiction of South Africa, you look at how lawyers have acted as formalists under the apartheid era, but as instrumentalists in the constitutional democracy, quite different from what one would imagine in a democracy that comes out of human rights abuses. And lawyers are tending to think about how to get around the rules rather than the rules are rules. And so the Ethics for Justice module attempts to see lawyers as champions for justice and a rationale to serve justice. So I think Helena had said that how do we get students to buy in to the ends of the justice system. So if I could get to the next slide, this is just an example of the case study that we managed to record. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that you've got Wim Trengove. You can see him in the slide. He tells the story of representing the people against the apartheid government. He has a witness who has assisted him in discovering what exactly the police had done. The witness lies to the commission, telling the commission he's never spoken to Trengove. Trengove then has to make a decision. Does he keep with the professional rule that one may not lie to the court or to the commission, or does one keep confidences, especially the confidence of a witness who had assisted in really showing the police to be unlawful and having shot these people without it wasn't out of self-defense, but it was rather they lost their nerve. And so what happens in this particular case study is there are instructions in the localized model for students to consider 3 questions, very much in terms of experiential learning. You know, what the ethical dilemma was, what choices the legal practitioner had, and what decision could or should have they made in the context. And it really is about students understanding that process of ethical decision-making, as Helena was talking about. And not only, if you look at right at the beginning, not only the strengthening of the ethical values, but the ability and recognizing the difficulty of some contexts in acting on those values. And so if I could get to the next slide, that is really what I wanted to talk about, is just the localization. And again, I know Helena's given you the integrity and ethics link, but if you also want a link to the Langer Massacre case study, that's available on YouTube. And I'm happy for any correspondence or queries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helen. And Helen, maybe if you want, you can put those links in the chat of this discussion as well, so they can click on it directly. Our next speaker is Catherine Ordway. Catherine is an assistant professor of sports management at the University of Canberra in Australia. She is a sports lawyer with degrees from the University of Adelaide, and she has a graduate diploma in investigations management from Charles Stewart University. Catherine was awarded her sports management PhD titled Protecting Sports Integrity, Sport Corruption Risk Management Strategies in 2019. Her edited book, Restoring Trust in Sport, Corruption Cases and Solutions, will be published in April 2021. Catherine is a senior fellow with the University of Melbourne Law School and an affiliated scholar with the Global Institute for Responsible Sport Organizations, or GERSO. And she's also an expert consultant with SIGPA, which stands for Sports Integrity and Governance Partners. Welcome, Catherine. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you to everybody tuning in today. I wanted to give you a chance to see how the E4J modules can work in different contexts. And as Melissa mentioned, I teach sports management students in both leadership in sport and in a subject that used to be just called sports law, but it is now sports integrity, ethics and the law, because I like to call it just because you can doesn't mean you should. So if we can go to the slides, I can put the context of how I like to teach the SDG for 16 in context with the SDG for gender equality, number 5. Next slide, please, now. So to start with, I give them module 1 from the E4J, where we talk about the ethical theories and discuss whether it's possible to have universal values. Once we work out it's quite difficult to distill universal values, I look then in the sport context, and in our world, the Olympic Charter sets out a concept of Olympism, which is up there on the slide. And you can see that that refers to universal fundamental ethical principles and concepts of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. We talk about what that might mean, and of course, excellence in sport, taken to its very furthest length, can inspire people to cheat, particularly cheat to win, which leads to doping. The World Anti-Doping Agency is in the next slide, and they've addressed these concepts and ethical principles through developing what's called the spirit of sport. And you can see there the very first dot point under the World Anti-Doping Code is ethics, fair play and honesty and excellence in performance. And we talk about these tensions. How do we achieve both fair play whilst achieving excellence? And when athletes are being pushed to be as close to the fair play line as you possibly can. That leads us then to talk about our own values and our personal values. And we use one of the exercises in the first module, which is to have a mocktail party where we're developing our own values, looking at the Mind Tools website, and we walk around the room introducing ourselves through the fundamental value that we've chosen for ourselves and do that comparison. So that tends to work very well. And then we look at bringing in the gender equality provision, because I'm interested in the link between anti-corruption and gender equality. Next slide, please, Na. We talk about, first of all, in the leadership setting, because I also teach leadership in sport, what are the hard skills we'd be looking for in our decision makers, what is called the soft skills, and of course gender is one of the diversity principles that we're looking for. Unfortunately in sport we don't see gender represented equally as you would expect across the community, despite the number of women playing and participating in sport in a number of different spaces. Next slide, please. No. You can see here this idea of the male decision makers. Traditionally in sports boards, it's what is referred to is the OPSM, the old, pale, male and stale, and there's no cultural diversity, regional diversity, educational and social diversity, as that quote sets out there. Next slide, please. How does that cause an issue for us? We have in the sports setting a number of different high-profile corruption in sport cases which we refer to. And so then we look at the research around corruption and how gender equality might assist in lowering the risk of corruption in sport. And we discuss that and tease it out in different contexts and look at how the different ethical theories might assist us to make decisions if we were in these different contexts. Next slide, please. I also like to give the students this exercise, which is in Module 9 of the E4J modules, where we look at Michael Kimmel's work. And in his TED Talk, which is very accessible for the students because it's available on YouTube, of course, he talks about privilege being invisible to those who have it. And we discuss that and how the students might be able to relate to it in their own lives. In the next slide, you can see the questions that are in the module that I can put to the students, and we can either discuss it in class, or I've also used it as a specific assessment piece for them to think about a particular example in their workplaces, their clubs, their playing environments, whichever sport they're involved with, to think about how their own implicit bias might have blinded them to particular behaviour. Next slide, please. The other module I like to use is also in Module 9, and this exercise is called the Gender Decoder. Next slide sets it out. Kat Matfield is a coder who developed this tool based on evidence-based research that indicates that the language that's used in recruitment advertisements really impacts whether or not women will apply for particular jobs. So this research has indicated that men really don't care about the language that's used, whether it's masculinized language, gender-neutral language or feminized language. If they think they have the skill set, then they'll apply. This is not the case for women, and the research indicates that there are particular words used in advertisements that can be off-putting for women to apply. So I get the students to go and have a look, and if you look on the next slide, this is the local example I use in Australia, and these are the masculine and feminine words, and I say to the students we can discuss whether we agree or disagree with some of the words that have been chosen here in the research, but this is what has been found. In the next slide, I take them to a local website, which is a sport one, the Sport Australia Clearinghouse, which sets out a number of different jobs. And because these are undergraduates, of course, thinking about their first job in the workforce, I ask them to choose a job there that they think they might like to apply for. And all they have to do is cut and paste and put it into the Gender Decoder tool that I've put on the link that Kat Matfield developed, and then they can see how the language appears. In the next slide, I've given an example of what that looks like. This is a current advertisement that's on the Sport Australia website, a senior consultant of strategy, which I anticipated would have quite masculinized language because it's a strategic job. However, it's come out under the Gender Decoder as a feminine coded advertisement. So this is really interesting because the types of words that she's highlighted as being feminine based on this research are responsible, supports, collaborative. If we compare this to the next one, the next slide, which is an ad that's currently in place for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, of course, which is very topical given that we are ostensibly sitting in Kyoto today, is to look at this advertisement, and this is masculine coded. And of course, this is very interesting in the context at the moment about discussions about how much women speak in meetings, for example, which has been topical in the sports space. So we can talk about this in class because it links back to current events that are happening. And you can see here that the words analyse, analysis, determining, and even competition, which is perhaps a little challenging in the sports space to be a masculinized word, has come up as something that may be off-putting for some women in the sports industry. And if you want to get the full talent pool available to you when you're doing your recruitment, then you want everybody to apply. Next slide, please. So that's what I wanted to cover, is just to give you an indication of the way that I like to use my E4J modules in the sports setting, and I'm very happy to discuss this further with other people if you have ideas or you've had an opportunity to implement it in your own setting. I welcome that, and my details are there. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So I am actually going to be your next speaker. My name is Melissa Deering, and I'm an attorney admitted in California, and I work as a clinical assistant professor at Qatar University Faculty of Law in Doha, Qatar. I was the founding director and creator of my college's externship program, and I've taught advocacy, ethics, and professionalism to more than 1,000 Qatari law students since 2011. My research focuses on SDGs 5, gender equality, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and how culture affects local legal professions and legal education. I'm an advocate for the global women, peace, and security agenda, and I work to encourage more women in the Middle East, specifically in the Gulf, to pursue legal, judicial, and diplomatic careers. And I'm also the lead principal investigator for sub-project 3 called SDG Ed in Higher and Tertiary Education in Qatar, which is part of the recently awarded $2.5 million NPRP cluster grant, SDG Education and Global Citizenship in Qatar. And I'm very proud to say we're one of only 2 non-STEM clusters ever awarded in the history of the NPRPC program. So we're very, very excited about that. Today, I'm here to speak with you about my experience adapting E4J modules and using them to teach different concepts here in Qatar. I also want to give you a few samples and examples that will hopefully you can take back and incorporate into your own teaching. So a tiny bit about my background so you can understand what I teach and why. I'm a former defense attorney. A little more than a decade ago, I worked as court-appointed defense counsel in juvenile dependency proceedings or child abuse proceedings before the San Francisco Superior Court. And when I moved to Qatar, what initially struck me was how few female students we had graduating and pursuing careers as lawyers and judges and prosecutors and law professors. And it was a big problem. And it's still a problem, but we're working on it and trying to empower more women to join us. So one of the ways that I've used E4J is to teach about gender equality and justice and ethics and philosophy. And what I've transitioned into and really love to teach about and use E4J to teach about is the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, which I incorporate with SDGs 5 and 16. So now, if you don't mind, could I start my slides, please? So I'm first going to show you a few ways, thanks Na, that I've worked with Module 9 of the Ethics and Integrity Tertiary modules. So I've adopted many of these modules for several courses I teach. And now we can move to the next slide, please. I'm going to do a gender focus on this presentation. Oh, you can go back one. But I want to be clear that these materials have been fun to teach on a variety of topics, including one that I love to do, which is an example here, how to balance professional and personal ethics dilemmas, which is a common theme for defense attorneys. And so here's just a quick example of how I built that topic into a larger class for a large class for male and female students. But today I'm going to talk about gender, which is Module 9, the same one Catherine was just referring to. So I can go to the next slide, Na. So if I'm teaching about women, peace, and security for the first time, I like to start out with a conversation. I'm going to ask the students, what does equality mean to them? And then we'll just keep asking different students, and we'll have until we have a pretty comprehensive definition. And then I'm going to ask them whether they think that gender equality is still an issue. And then we'll have an honest conversation about it. And that usually turns into a pretty lively debate, and not everyone agrees with each other about whether it's still an issue. So then I will bring in the global goals, and I'll explain SDGs 5 and 16, and I'll make it clear that globally gender equality is still an issue. And for that, then I'll bring in the Women, Peace, and Security resolution and the actual law, and I'll bring in statistics, and I'll bring in UN women's statistics, and kind of pull in anything that I'm researching at that moment, or any papers I'm working on that I want to test out to see if my students are going to be good little peer reviewers. And we'll just be looking at about gender equality at the global level. I bring in the law, the actual Security Council resolution. We'll discuss how it urges member states to empower women and increase their representation at all levels of decision-making institutions and peace processes. But then we'll discuss if we view this as an actual obligation. It's urging, it's not requiring. So we'll discuss, about international treaties and urging, and if this is enough and if it's not enough, and how can we monitor and regulate and all of that kind of stuff. So next slide, please. Then I'm going to bring it back to Qatar, and we can go back to the one with Sheikh Hermosa. Thanks, and one back, please. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'll talk about how women, peace, and security is important to Qatar as a UN member state. It's if it doesn't want to go back, let it be. The technology. And I will discuss how Her Highness Sheikh Hermosa is an SDG advocate, and I'll discuss about the priorities and what an SDG advocate is, and we'll talk about other major efforts Qatar has made to increase efforts in women, peace, and security. I think my slides just went on an auto run, so I apologize. I don't know what happened, but if they can come back, life would be great. I will also discuss the Qatari Constitution, and we'll talk about the different policies and international treaties such as CEDAW that Qatar has enacted and ratified. And I'll bring in speeches by His Highness the Emir or Her Highness Sheikh Hermosa, the Queen Mother, and we'll discuss whether we think Qatar is fulfilling its obligations for United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. But then I'll bring in current statistics, and I'll bring us back to the reality and show the students why gender equality, and even more for me in my research, why women in law and women in the judiciary and women in diplomacy and women in international relations is still an issue in Qatar. So I will highlight some not awesome statistics about women's participation in Qatar's legal profession that are in a paper I published last year. Is there any hope of getting those slides back or no? Just wanted to kind of show those statistics. But anyway, that if you want to look up those statistics, again, I'll put a link in the chat. It's the Emerging Legal Profession in Qatar Diversity Challenges and Realities. And then I'll share specific stories about being one of the only female faculty members in my college, and some of the experiences being the only woman in the room during important discussions. And we will chat about how to rectify this issue, this gap between the obligations of the state and what the state wants to achieve and what the state's vision and the 2030 agenda is, and how the general public in Qatar feels what should be the reality. And generally, my students are very good at understanding this issue and talking through all of the sub-issues, which can be quite complicated, actually, and can include religion and different religious concepts. And not everyone agrees with each other, but what is excellent about it is we really engage in critical analysis. I will also highlight some research by a colleague who's I cite in that paper, and I'll put it in the chat, I have statistics from her as well. And I can maybe put the chats, put the slides, maybe we can post the slides or something after the conference. So I will pull up research by a colleague about what she has found that's relevant to women's rights and empowerment. And basically, since I don't have the slide to explain it, I can say that she did a poll of Qatari nationals about their opinions regarding Qatari women's right to work. And she found that, and she did it on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. And there are some very disturbing statistics in there about strongly disagreeing that women should be leaders, strongly disagreeing that women should be judges, slightly disagreeing that women should be lawyers, and other statistics about women not being able to that they should not vote, that they should consult their husband before voting, that they need their husband's permission to work, and so anyway, I'll give it to you because it's an interesting slide and interesting statistics that she found. But then we'll talk about these rights, and that study of my colleagues is from 2017, I believe. It's not very old, so when you talk to the students about it, they'll think it's really old and no, it doesn't apply. When they see it's 2017, that brings in a whole nother level of discussion. So then we'll also discuss crimes against women, and we'll continue to chat about laws and legal systems and how they can be used for good and also still be part of the problem. And then how can we deal with that? And then I'll tone it down and I'll bring it back to being more experiential. And I'll use an exercise directly from Module 9 that I adapted for Qatar, and that's called the Power Walk and the Privilege Walk. And essentially that has to do with what Catherine was talking about before, how bias is invisible to those who see it, or privilege is invisible to those who have it. And so this is a physical exercise where I put them in different positions, and we adapted it for Qatar so that there are positions like a housemaid or a migrant worker, up to a male Qatari judge. And we have different personalities that are more relevant to here. Yay, nah, thank you. Nah, would it be possible to go back a couple slides so I can just, if it won't mess things up, perfect. We can go back even one more even, and I'll just go there. So these are the not awesome statistics about women in law that I will show them. And then we will go to the next slide, which has to do with my university, my college. So this is actually the number of female faculties in my department in the College of Law. So also not awesome statistics. And then the next one, which I want to linger on if you can see it, this is my colleague's research in the College of Arts and Science. Her name is Dr. Khalfan El-Ghanem, and hopefully you can see the strongly agree, strongly disagree. And this is based just on gender. Okay. All right, and again, this is highlighted in that paper, so I'll put that link, and then you guys can see it up close and personal. And thanks. Now we can go to the next slide. So this power walk, this privilege walk, and then the students will actually physically take a step forward if the answer is yes, and take a step backwards if no. So the whole point of it is that they will physically distance themselves from the others, and it's actually a strong, amazing. I've done it with high school students, middle school students, and our university students. They love it, and it's a very strong visual cue for them. And then if I have time, I'll show them a video about privilege, and then we'll just do this exercise. I also use two popular TED videos from Chimamanda Adichie in my full semester class. I use her The Danger of a Single Story and Why We Should All Be Feminist. And I find those are very good for people from all cultures, all backgrounds, conservative or liberal, and she's excellent. So we have a lot of interesting discussions on that. And we can do the next slide now. I'll talk about the RateMyProfessor.com study and how female educators in the USA are evaluated differently by their students based on nothing more than their gender. And then I actually turn it around to show them how I found similar results in Qatar. I analyzed more than 230 student surveys evaluating their employer supervisors during a 10-week and 120-hour externship experience. So when they think, oh, that's America, then I can say, well, you guys did it exactly the same. And that's important because the externship class is mandatory, so they all have to take it, so they all have to rate their supervisor, so it's a good common point. And I'll do other exercises with them, that many of them that Catherine mentioned and my other colleagues discussed. But what I really want to take time to tell you about are some of the results. So we'll go to the next slide. And first, these educational materials have led to increased student activism. And here are some of my photos of my students teaching other students. In several of my classes, I made it a project that I would teach them something from E4J, and they would have to then take what I taught and adapt it and make it theirs, and then go teach it to local high school students or middle school students. So we call this street law in clinical legal education. And my students absolutely loved it. No matter how shy or nervous or worried they were, all of them came back with more self-confidence and better speaking abilities, and sometimes even changed career goals. One of my students who had previously told me she would never, ever be a trial attorney told me she was reconsidering because maybe speaking at court wouldn't be so bad after all. And this also helped me secure partnerships and secure additional student speaking opportunities with other social advocacy initiatives like SIMOON, the Hague International Model United Nations Qatar. And it helped me recruit enough students to participate in 2 student competitions. That's that one up there in the top. And the students who participated in those competitions took the materials even further, and they created videos about concepts like cyber crimes against women, which then they approached from an Islamic perspective. So we were able to circulate the videos on social media and create even more community activism. Next slide, please. And these E4J materials and the debates we practiced in class then helped my students feel more comfortable going to be peer mentors for high school students participating in the Model UN and the Model CCPCJ. And my students were then giving debate and oral argument advice to these younger students, and then all of them are learning from each other, and all of them are gaining more skills, and all of them are becoming more empowered. Next slide, please. And all of this led to new research, not just my research, which it did, but it also, a colleague from Oxford who's a behavioral economist was actually able to study me in my class and test whether teaching these materials modified students' ethical attitudes and frame sets. And in short, it did. And then that led me to have the ability, my own institution, to push for new courses that I wanted to build that focused even more on E4J and research. And then my uni approved it. So we had even more student research, and we even had a semester clinic during which students tackled the quite controversial topics of prisoners' rights here in Doha. So next slide, please. And this is the end. So the coolest experience, though, was all of this led to the creation of Voices of Qatari Women in Law and International Diplomacy, which was an oral history project and interactive research exhibit. And the goal of this project was to increase the historical documentation regarding women's leadership in Qatari society and to contradict popular stereotypes regarding Gulf women by providing more history of their societal participation and leadership. And then we also wanted to inspire youth and introduce them to the history of their role models. So with my students' help, this exhibit toured Doha prior to the pandemic, and my students staffed the exhibit at each event, and they brought their friends and their families, and they explained the importance of the exhibit and the research and the women who we highlighted. And it is completely because of their support and the enthusiasm that, based on event attendance records, we estimate this exhibit was visited by more than 1,000 people, and we received more than 300 positive response cards and pledges. So next slide, please. This was just a phenomenal result. Okay, but then maybe I had no more slides. So I am done. Now it is time. And I'm going to tease them a little bit. For one night only, live and dangerous, the one, the only. And I'm just teasing, by the way, but I do want to introduce you to our last speaker, Hugh McFall. And I think you'll agree with me that he's the most fun member of the group. And he did imply he wanted a unique introduction tonight. So we saved the best for last, so you'll remember our session. Hugh is the director of the Open Justice Center at the Open University Law School, and he's a consultant for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. He has research interests in the public understanding of law, legal ethics, and technology-enhanced learning. As director of the Open Justice Center, he has developed a range of innovative community-based initiatives and is particularly interested in harnessing the potential of online technologies to support the work of civil society organizations. Welcome, Hugh, and thank you for being a good sport, and the floor is.
Melissa, thank you very much for that unforgettable introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm speaking to you from the UK, and it's 1:15 in the morning. I don't usually give presentations at this time, so Catherine, I feel a little older, paler and staler than I normally do. So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to you in this very interesting panel. And now, if you mind putting the slides up, please. And I don't have too long, so I'm just going to pick up on some of the themes that my colleagues have been talking about. Bianca started the session by explaining how the UNODC have launched the Education for Justice initiative to engage with universities throughout the world, and we've heard from my colleagues on the panel about how they've applied that in their teaching in Singapore, in South Africa, in Australia, and in Qatar, and they've applied it in different contexts. They've localized the resources, they've been applying them to different subject areas and helped to develop student skills around ethics. So we can see already that the Education for Justice initiative has had a big impact. And my involvement in it has really been to try and leverage the expertise that we have in the Open University, which is based on distance learning and using technology to support and open access to education to students internationally. And I'd like now, if you could put it on the next slide, I'd like you all to remember a time when we could do things like this, meet together in a room. Next slide, please, Nar, and I'll take you further down memory lane. Unfortunately, one of our colleagues, Sigal, was hoping to speak with us tonight, and she's unable to be there, but I thought I'd include her on some of the photos. And next slide, please, Nar. Another photograph. So this is my engagement with E4J was originally in these face-to-face sessions, and I'm pleased to see that one of the cornerstones of the E4J modules has just arrived in the room. Professor Albanese, Jay Albanese, nice to see you, Jay. Thanks for coming. And I met Jay and many of the panelists through these events. And what I thought was interesting about the way that the E4J materials were created and disseminated was that there was a big emphasis on experiential learning. So the way that the workshops would run is that they'd engage local academics in different countries and explain how the principles of integrity, ethics, anti-corruption could be taught to students in engaging, interactive ways. So given my background in distance learning and relying on online education, I had to think about how we could perhaps use online methods to support that and initiate it in my own university context. Next slide, please, now. So my thought was, how can our university help this essence of the experiential nature of the Education for Justice pedagogy? How could we support that in an online university? So next slide, please, Nar. So my job was really to think about looking at the integrity and ethics modules initially, and specifically the teaching guide. Next slide, please. And Helena mentioned in her talk that to support the Education for Justice, Integrity and Ethics modules, there's a teaching guide which explains the underlying pedagogy of the modules in terms of its interactive nature and the experiential exercises that were engaged in the underpinned, if you like, the way that the module was taught. Next slide, please, now. So what I wanted to do was kind of bottle that live experience, if you like, So bottle that live interactive experience that we would see in the workshops, and also that we would encourage our colleagues as lecturers to engage with students with, and see how we could use that and make that accessible, that type of approach, in an online format. So my university, and I've been involved in supporting organisations to try and use online resources to develop experiential learning. So I've shown on the slide there some of the recent projects we've done with FIFA. I've worked with other UK charities to try and develop this type of online engagement. Next, please. So, using that experience, we developed a course, an online course designed to support the aim of the Education for Justice initiative, which is essentially to empower lecturers throughout the world to be able to engage and deliver this form of experiential education in terms of the issues to do with integrity and ethics and anti-corruption specifically were addressed in this module. So next slide, please, Nar. So the fundamental for this interactive course was to take the building blocks of the teaching guide, which underpinned the rest of the integrity and ethics module, and to highlight the principles of using experiential learning and varied and active engagement, encouraging self-awareness amongst the students and giving a social context to the learning. And these principles were explained and explored using different examples from across the integrity and ethics modules initially, and then later in a later iteration we also incorporated the anti-corruption modules as well. So 2 of the 9 E4J modules. So can I have the next slide, please, now? And what we did is we built within it teaching examples from the module. So the way that the online course was built was to integrate and illustrate the interactive exercises that are the cornerstone, the backbone of the E4J approach to the module. So these were given a front and center focus in terms of the way that the pedagogy course was developed and delivered. Next slide, please. So what effect has it had? Well, it's been available in its latest iteration for only for a few months, and already we've reached nearly 5,000 learners. The feedback we've got from the course has been very positive, and I think it's succeeded in its core focus, which was to supplement the face-to-face training that colleagues at the UNODC and us as E4J champions have been supporting in different universities around the world. And of course, you know, when we started building the course, we didn't anticipate the pandemic and the social distancing and the fact that these workshops are now more difficult to run. So it's been very helpful, I think, to be able to offer this online version of training for colleagues during the pandemic. So that was kind of an unintended benefit, but it's been an important one over the last few months. Next slide, please. For me, I think this raises the question of, you know, how can the E4J project be built upon from this experience? And I would argue that I think in terms of conceptualizing what the E4J has been doing, I think is it's trying to build a community of practice. So the concept of a community of practice is fairly common within pedagogy discourse, and I think it's a good way of understanding what E4J is trying to do, is to try and energize and engage and create a community of educators who are concerned with integrity and ethics and anti-corruption issues in their teaching. And I think there's a space, as well as the Education for Justice website, the type of online training that we've produced is a space to support and energize that community of practice. Next slide, please. And the findings from this has led to some work I'm doing with the UNODC to advise on the development of their education provision on their main website. I'm advising on a project called GRACE, Global Resources for Anti-Corruption Education, which is to try and distill a little bit of that idea of a community of practice and re-energize the way in which the online presence in terms of education, higher education on the UNODC website can support this growth of a community of practice of educators interested in these issues. Next slide, please, Now. So this GRACE portal aims to offer accessible resources, development of a community of practice, to offer skills development for educators, promote the UNODC initiatives, and essentially be an interactive resource that can support the work of the UNODC. Next slide, please. So for me, this raises some interesting issues around, roles of universities in supporting these types of initiatives. And I think what all the panelists have shown tonight is that I think there's a great appetite and enthusiasm for lecturers working in their specific university context to have a tangible way in which they can support the sustainable development goals by supporting an initiative like Education for Justice. So I've given you an example of how a distance learning university has been able to contribute to that wider aim, and I'll put in the chat box shortly a link to that so you can access it for yourself. So Melissa, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Now, if you could put the last slide on, and thank you for taking me at my word and giving me an unusual introduction. So an unusual sign off. It wasn't quite as live and as dangerous as normal, but it is 1:30 in the morning. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, Hugh. And I just want to wrap it out. I'm sorry I didn't leave time for questions, but I thought it was more important that you get to see the wide variety of utilization of the E4J, and I thought that would be great. Obviously, you can reach out to any of us. We're all going to be at this Congress digitally for the next several days. You can reach out to any of us if you have questions. I want to thank you so much to my panelists for coming today. Thank you so much. You guys were phenomenal, and I hope for everyone who attended to see how you adapt E4J in the future. And if there's anything else anyone want to say, I will leave it at that with our 1 minute, 2 minutes left. So are there any points for my panelists that you want to say? Actually, I can toss it to Bianca. Is there anything that you might want to say that we might have missed? Not to put you on the spot, I apologize.
No, Melissa, thank you so much. Nothing that you have missed. It was just wonderful to be with all of you and to hear so many inspiring stories, how you have managed to make the E4J model yours, how you are advancing at your universities, and again, showing to all of us how important it is that we, all of us, take it seriously. Reaching the SDGs is a joint undertaking and a joint responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the United Nations alone. It's not the responsibility of the member states. It's the responsibility of all of us. And education has a key role to play. Education has a key role to play so that also the next generation takes it onward. So with this, a big thanks and a good night from Vienna. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, for sharing how you are advancing and how you're supporting education for justice from all the different universities you are from. With this, Melissa, back to you. Good night and goodbye.
Good night, and one more person to thank. Thank you, Na, our room host, and Nazira, our second room host, for making the slides work and making everything go seamlessly. Thank you so much, and good night, good morning, and have a great day, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.